Hey, everybody. Whoops. Hey, everybody. I think this probably needs to turn on somehow, right? Okay. Well, I'm going to take your word for it. Okay, that it feels on now. Thanks everybody for coming today. Enjoy your lunch. This is going to be a fascinating conversation. Um, when you think about it, many of the breakthroughs for artificial intelligence, they occur in the West of the United States. The regulations and the laws they're going to occur here. And AI right now feels like an unprecedented like, technological, life-altering step toward the future. And I've been in Washington for 35 years, and what is also unprecedented is the demand by industry, in this case, the tech industry, for Washington to act, to regulate, to issue guidelines, to pass laws, to set standards, to simultaneously propel AI forward and to rein it in. And you just don't see that very often. So Washington has a big job. That job's going to require some humility, which is also not a Washington strong point, because there's a lot we don't know. And at Third Way, I think we're in the same position as a lot of folks, which is we want to learn more in the hopes that we ultimately get the best out of AI and avoid the worst. And we're going to be exploring various topics. And today's will be on disinformation, with the question being, will AI propel or thwart disinformation? And starting us off will be Congressman Derek Kilmer, who is ideally suited to be at the center of any AI legislation. So, um, Rep. Kilmer he's a nerd, right? He's a nerd, a wonk, a science geek, a sci-fi enthusiast, big picture thinker. He can get in the weeds. He's the former chair of the House New Democrats. He has a cousin who played a prostitute in a soap opera. That's a fun fact, but it's a bit of a non sequitur. We'll see how AI, a chatbot, uh, handles that fact. He's now vice chair and head of the New Dem Policy Committee. Of course, the New Dems are actively engaged in the AI discussion, and Derek Kilmer is leading that group. Um, he's been outspoken and concerned about disinformation and has legislation on this subject. And then one final point before I turn it over to the congressman. He announced recently he's going to be leaving Congress at the end of this term and returning, I was going to say returning full time to Washington State, but his future is actually unknown at this point. Um, over the next year, you're going to hear many people sing your praises. I just want to add to that chorus. Uh, Truly, you were the type of member of Congress that the founding fathers were thinking about representing this country. Um, you know, just the best of what the House of Representatives is, thoughtful, trying to get to the right answer, a great listener, a tremendous thinker, cares about the institution, truly an institutionalist, as we were talking before. And as for Third Way, you've been just a great friend and a great partner, and um, just a godsend in this sometimes very difficult town. So thank you so much for joining us today and for your service in Congress.
Well, I have two reactions to the kind words that Jim just said. One, I'm still getting accustomed to being eulogized while I'm still alive. And second, I'm going to do my best not to screw all that up in the next 10 minutes. But it's great to be with you. Thank you to Jim and to Third Way for not just extending the invitation, but continuously leading the charge on issues that matter. As Jim mentioned, I served as the former chair of the New Democrat Coalition, which is made up of 100 pragmatic, forward-thinking House Democrats who really work on trying to cross the aisle and work across the Capitol to advance innovative thinking on issues that matter. So, the theme of today's panel focused on AI and impacts to disinformation is not just timely, but critically important. As some of you might have guessed, my perspective on AI and similarly transformative technologies is that they represent the next great frontier of technological advancement. Let me start with the good news. First, you've seen folks in Congress waking up to the notion that AI has enormous potential with the opportunity to shape everything from national security strategy to how we fight disease, uh, how we how and what information is spread online to how we deploy resources to combat hunger or poverty or to reduce crime. Even in Congress, AI is being used now to find smarter policy answers by the Congressional Research Service, to write bill summaries, to respond to constituent correspondence, and to try to build a more strategic schedule of committee and floor action. So we are already seeing it deployed in the Capitol. Secondly, importantly, you've also seen Congress waking up to some of the threats posed by AI and by the proliferation of large language models. We know that while there is economic opportunity, there is also potential of enormous job displacement. We know that there is risk about the spread of misinformation, which our panelists today will discuss, about the violation of privacy, about the perpetuation of harmful bias, about threats to security. How do we set guardrails on everything from deep fake technology to the use of facial recognition to preventing AI from even launching a nuclear weapon by itself? So, how do we get ahead of some of these threats before it's too late? Third, and you're seeing members of Congress really engage on that. Third, we're seeing serious bipartisan interest in this subject. Interestingly, you're seeing Democrats and Republicans embrace the need for a framework and laws consistent with that framework. Ideas that have included requirements for the licensing and auditing of AI, the creation of an independent federal office to oversee the technology, questions around liability for violations of privacy and civil rights, and requirements for data transparency and safety standards. Just to highlight a few of the questions that we are grappling with, and I chair a work group within the New Democrat Coalition, and some of the questions that we're asking are probably some of the questions you all are asking, and I figured I would just share them with you. How do we make sure, for example, that the U.S. continues to lead innovation in this space, that it sets the standards in this space based on our values? How do we thread the needle between innovation and regulation? Where do we have voluntary rules as announced by several of the largest tech companies in the White House not too long ago? And where do we have binding rules that are established by Congress? When should regulations be cross sectoral and when should they be vertical or domain specific? Should the focus be on regulating the inputs to the AI system, or as I think most are leaning in Congress toward focusing on outputs? How do we attract the students and skilled workers to lead the way in this world? My former employer, McKinsey, has estimated that 375 million workers globally will be displaced by automation and AI by 2030. The World Economic Forum has said 133 million new roles will emerge. So, how do we get that math to work so that we see more prosperity for more people, not less? How and when do we share information with other governments and organizations? How do we harmonize our rules once we set them with the EU and others? And finally, we're grappling with sector specific questions. For example, how, if at all, should Congress seek to constrain the spread of disinformation on social media, particularly when it appears that it has greater virality because of AI algorithms? How do we use medical information to improve outcomes and performance without enabling equity issues? These are some of the questions that the New Dem AI Working Group are grappling with and will continue to grapple with in the months ahead. Already, the group has kicked off with some fact finding conversations on the topic that we're addressing today. We sent a letter to top social media platforms and generative AI companies to better understand the landscape of deep fakes and deceptive synthetic media as we see more synthetic online content intended to deceive users, including videos and images and audio. It's clear that all of us need to take this seriously. That's why a few years ago, I helped pass the Deepfake Report Act and the NDAA, which requires annual study and reporting by the Department of Homeland Security on the study of digital content forgery, including deepfakes. It's important that platforms where AI generated content is created, platforms where that content is distributed and shared, and lawmakers are working to get together to address risks associated with deceptive synthetic media. And it's crucial that users have the tools to distinguish between authentic and computer generated content. So I think that's critical. Our democracy really depends on that. So I look forward to hearing some of the insights today, hearing your concerns, your ideas, and hopefully to working together as we venture into this brave new world of AI. Let's hope we do so with some foresight and with some responsibility and a shared commitment to using it for good. So thanks again for having me, and thanks again to Third Way for your leadership.
Thank you so much, Congressman. So important that you're leading that AI working group with the new Dems. New Dems are going to be critical in this, and an issue we're looking forward to see what the recommendations you come up with. Very excited about the panel discussion we're about to have on really whether AI is going to propel or thwart disinformation. So let me bring up our moderator, uh, Olga Belagalova. I'm going to introduce her, then she will introduce our panelists, and then we're going to let the fun begin, okay? So Olga Belagalova is an expert on, among other things, communications and how humans communicate from the printing press to radio to television to the internet, how those technologies brought about enormous societal change and information and disinformation from Martin Luther to Orson Welles to Don Draper to Yevgeny Prigozhin. And if that should sound familiar to you, right? Because I stole them from you. I lifted them nearly verbatim from a talk you gave and I watched on YouTube. I think it was at the Atlantic Council. And it was just fascinating and really interesting and eye-opening. So Olga is the director of the Emerging Technologies Initiative at Johns Hopkins at SAIS, and a professor at the, I'm going to mispronounce this, Alperovitch, of course, Alperovitch Institute of Cybersecurity Studies, where she teaches on disinformation and influence in the digital age. Previously, she taught at Georgetown. She spent 6.5 years at Meta, where she led policy to counter and disrupt online influence operations with a particular focus on Russia and Eastern Europe. We do have some things in common. You went to Boston University. What dorm?
The Shelton Hall.
Oh, that's not
Yeah.
bad.
At the beginning. Yeah.
That's not bad.
Wow, it took me a minute
could
there.
do a lot worse. Okay, good for you. I was in Danielson. That's not so bad either. You're fluent in English. So am I.
We'll find out.
You're fluent in Russian. That's where we start to differ. And just learn this, and I'm sure she shares this with so many folks in this room, a competitive synchronized swimmer. Right? A lot of folks here have done that. So thank you so much for leading this important discussion. We've got a great panel, and really interested in what you have to say.
Great. Thank you so much.
Need some help with that? We got section, okay.
We're just going to do a bit of chair rearranging here. So I'm just going to TED Talk, stand here while that's happening, and entertain you with some synchronized swimming dance moves. All right. I think we can. Great. Well, thank you so much for coming here. I'm really excited for this conversation. It's very timely, and it's very important to have it here in Washington, D.C., and with the experts that we have here. So I'd like to bring up both of our experts, and I'm going to introduce them one by one. Our first expert is Bilva Chandra, who is a Technology and Security Policy Fellow at the RAND Corporation. She previously worked on product safety and trust and safety at OpenAI. And prior to that, she worked on threat intelligence focused on influence operations at LinkedIn. If you want to come up. Great. And now we've got Clement Wolf. He is the head of information quality strategy at Google's trust and safety team. In that capacity, he helps drive Google's work to shore up the integrity of Google services and release safe AI tools in the world. Clement has spent most of his career at Google working on various product teams, and we had a chance to work together when I was working at Meta, and we spent many hours talking to the European Commission as the war in Ukraine unfolded. So please join us. So let's get this conversation started. One of the things that we often talk about that you might have read about when you were coming to this panel and thinking about artificial intelligence and disinformation and influence is the sort of grand threat that we might be worried about. But one of the things I'd like to actually start with is how we might actually use artificial intelligence to address some of these problems. So you've both worked on information integrity issues at some major platforms like OpenAI, LinkedIn, and Google. And the conversation today, as I said, centers a lot on the threats and the harms that could come from artificial intelligence. But as we know, a lot of these tools have also been used by teams for years now, fact checkers, individuals looking to identify these types of campaigns, to try to use AI to significantly reduce the harms and the threats that we might see from artificial intelligence. And from disinformation threat actors. So perhaps you can both start and share a little bit about how you see artificial intelligence being used to detect misinformation at scale and to improve information integrity work. You want to start?
Sure. Okay, I think it's working. So I have perhaps a mixed response to this question. I think in some ways, AI is not entirely beneficial for detection efforts, which I'm happy to touch on. But I guess to start off with where it can be beneficial, during my time at LinkedIn and OpenAI, something that I found to be incredibly helpful with AI systems, detection systems at scale, was looking at very specific known disinformation narratives that were very niche to a particular actor. So for example, I spent a lot of time looking at Chinese influence actors, more specifically Spamouflage Dragon, also known as Dragon Bridge. And for those of you who are familiar with the Chinese IO from Dragon Bridge, it's pretty shitty. It's very spammy, right? Like there's often Mandarin mixed in with English, and there's kind of the same narratives being recycled over and over again for a lot of these campaigns. One of them being Yan Limeng, who's a well-known Chinese virologist, being a Chinese dissident. There's lots of disinformation about her in particular, about Steve Bannon, et cetera, and very specific words used, such as like diseased turtle in Mandarin to describe them, right? Very niche things that detection can be super, super helpful for. So in my perspective, where I see AI being helpful in detecting specifically disinformation narratives is when you have known inauthentic accounts and you can prove that they're inauthentic with a variety of different metadata sources. So from the time that the account was created to what kinds of profile pictures is the account using, like does a profile picture look fake? What does the account really post at all? What percentage of this account's posts are actually being caught by political classifiers, right? All that really important metadata combined with known disinformation narratives that you're literally doing keywords detection on to find specific accounts. And I think AI can be instrumental in that. That being said, right, those are known narratives by known actors conducting disinformation operations. Where I'm really concerned is kind of the vast unknown, whether that happens to be the same actors that are pushing brand new narratives that we're actually not quite aware of, right? We need that human investigator's touch to truly find, or completely new non-state actors that may be just opportunistic actors looking to spread a particular campaign in order to, I don't know, garner a lot of support for a specific businessman or a certain company. So I think those are kind of where the pitfalls of AI for detection begin. And I think just to touch on something that Rep. Kilmer talked about, which was, all these tools for AI detection being very important. I would strongly agree. I also think that some of these tools are not working very well. So specifically for AI image detectors, this company called Optic has a tool called AI or Not, and Bellingcat did a report about this tool and how good it is at actually detecting whether a given image is AI generated or not. And as soon as you compress an image, the accuracy of that tool goes way down, right? It's functionally not really usable. And almost every social media platform strips metadata, compresses pictures, information as soon as there's an upload on a platform, which makes tools like that not very useful. So mixed bag, right? I do have hope for a lot of these very narrow AI solutions to be used by trust and safety teams, but I think the detection solutions for the public need a lot of work.
I think it's important to definitely acknowledge the limitations of artificial intelligence, both as a tool to solve problems, but also as a threat. So perhaps you can talk a little bit more. You've done trust and safety work at Google. Clement, maybe you can talk a little bit about what you've seen in terms of using artificial intelligence and its limitations as well.
Sure thing. And thank you so much for being here. It's a fun conversation. Ooh, there was a bit of echo. First of all, of course, nothing to change to what Bill has said. These tools can and are being used by trust and safety teams across many of the large platforms you're familiar with and have been for quite some time, whether it is to build what's so-called classifiers or whether to supercharge the work of teams that review content day in, day out. I would taxonomize the sort of benefits for trust and safety teams in these two categories, right? Better detections of abuse types you have predefined and you can train a classifier against. So it can be a narrative, it can be something else, but you can be like, hey, I've established, my rules clearly establish this specific type of content is against my rules and should not be on my service. Can I train something to recognize this kind of content in the wild with granularity and finesse, such that the leads that my human analysts will review are more qualified and lead to more actions? You can't do without these reviews, I wouldn't think at this stage, just because of this so nuanced, but you can ensure that the time your human analysts spent reviewing content is better spent by qualifying the leads they get. So that's one thing. And then more broadly speaking, supercharging the work of trust and safety teams. In general, trust and safety is an intensely work-heavy apparatus. These human reviews, a lot of processes to handle, and so on and so forth. Insofar as LLMs can help automate or expand the leverage effect of some of these human analysts, that brings a lot of value to any organization working in this space and can help supercharge detection on all kinds of threats, not just disinformation. We talk about fact checkers, so I want to talk about that as well. I am not a fact checker, haven't been a fact checker, never worked in a fact checking organization, but I've heard from them that they find the same kinds of use cases fairly valuable, detecting narratives so that they know what to focus on fact checking, supercharging their own work, so help drafting fact checks that they can then review and so on and so forth. So it really helps the defense team quite a lot. In terms of the limitations, I of course would agree with Bilva as well that these tools are not perfect, and notably they cannot, in most cases, replace a human reviewer analysis. Especially when we talk about content, it's just such a difficult thing to analyze. When it comes to detection of things like deepfakes and audio, we say deepfakes, let's define that for a second. When we say deepfakes collectively, I can assume we mean content that is either generated or significantly edited by AI in a way that is likely deceptive and not really perceptible to the human eye or ear. Is that a fairly, okay, yeah. When we talk about deepfakes, there's a bunch of things that can be done to try to better shore up defenses against this, the potential proliferation of such content. Certainly detectors are one of them. These sort of classifiers that can try to detect whether an image in this case is AI generated. You're right that they're not perfect. I am somewhat hopeful that technology on the defense side continues to improve as technology on the offense side improves as well. So I wouldn't say, I think it would be misleading to think that any one silver bullet technological solution is going to resolve all of these problems. But on the flip side, I don't think it's worth panicking either. One, because we haven't really, we tend to underestimate resilience to a lot of these things. And two, because maybe not one solution, but a combination of different kinds of efforts can hopefully make a dent.
Thank you so much. So one thing that we think about, Representative Kilmer mentioned this in his opening remarks, is the concerns we might have around the misinformation side, which is of course distinct from the influence campaigns that are run by threat actors, by different governments. I'm a big stickler for definitions, and so I think it's important to make a distinction between individuals that share false information and those that are deliberately trying to deceive. Now, when we're talking about real individuals, people who are misinformed, sharing inaccurate information, we're also talking about their freedom of expression and privacy. So in your work at OpenAI, how can, based on what you've experienced, how can we build some of these tools to make sure that we're still protecting people's privacy and protecting their freedom of expression?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point being made. I think that one, definition's incredibly important. Two, I think kind of going off of what Clement is talking about in terms of not having one silver bullet to help solve this very massive gargantuan problem, I think misinformation certainly really touches on how silver bullets don't necessarily work, right? And I think something that I really want to touch on is the concept of epistemic security. So epistemology, thinking about how people access knowledge, how people process knowledge, how people gain access to information. I think right now what I'm really concerned about is epistemic security, in the sense that broadly there's a distrust in the information environment, a distrust that is very, very difficult to measure. As we all know, measuring the impact of disinformation is at best a very challenging science, at worst
Not really been done yet.
no. correct, right? So it's really hard to measure how these problems are actually affecting people. And the same thing with misinformation, right? We don't exactly know how bad misinformation is, in the sense that how much it's altered folks' opinions, right? Versus how much it's actually reinforced their current opinions about something. Like, lots of studies show that people just gravitate towards information that makes the most sense to them, that's most accommodating to them and their thoughts and their worldview. So in terms of freedom of expression and misinformation, I think the best solutions for this kind of a complex problem is not necessarily just content moderation. I think content moderation will always be a part of the equation, but I think really increasing information resilience, as we were talking about before. So a variety of solutions, both technical and non-technical, can help with that. I think, to start off, media literacy cannot be understated, right? And it's one non-technical solution that I think is probably pivotal to increase epistemic security and increase trust in not only media, but in content, in people, right, in viewpoints, and to help reduce some of the effects of polarization that we're seeing today. A lot of people don't even know how to interpret the content that they're seeing. I mean, I'm having trouble doing that, especially given recent conflicts and war zones, and trying to figure out what is real and what is not, and information that can't actually be fact-checked in the moment, right, because it's happening during a conflict. So I think lots of strategies, any sort of strategy to really tackle grassroots media literacy, whether that's done from a congressional level, right, legislation that's passed that really focuses on local communities, information resilience, I think is really, really important in both protecting free speech, right, having people have the right to say what they want to say and express their opinions online, but also understanding when they're about to reshare something or repost something on Twitter or quote tweet something or whatever, what could the implications of that be, and why it's probably important to read the article and question sources. I know a lot of this is almost comical because we work in this space, but it's a really, really huge issue. And I think it also targets minority communities in a way that is unprecedented, right? Like, WhatsApp disinformation, for example, remains a huge problem, especially with minority communities in the United States. Spanish language misinformation is another really huge issue. So I think starting with communities, starting local on misinformation issues is key. And then the technical side of the solution, I think, is more resilient technological solutions. So beyond just detection tools, I think they're a part of the equation. I think provenance shows a lot of promise, in my opinion, in the space. So provenance essentially is tracking the origin of a given piece of content. There's lots of different provenance technologies that are out there and some different frameworks to maintain provenance. But the goal there would be not necessarily to say whether some information is fake or is real, but rather showing the origin of a given piece of information, maybe what time it was created, right? Like the original metadata around a piece of information, having that metadata be accessible to users on social platforms, ideally, right? Because that's where the content is disseminated, and whether it's AI generated or not, or any sort of metadata, and then having a user then make their decision about how they would like to interpret the information. A decision that will only be supported by increased media literacy. So I think there's several different prongs of this problem that need to be tackled, but I'm hopeful in the sense that there's lots of solutions that are not even technological that can happen tomorrow if there was enough, will to make it happen, and congressional legislation passed about this issue. I think we just need to mobilize resources, start educating folks, and I mean, technology can play a really huge role too. Like large language models could be used to translate things for different immigrant communities, right? So there's a lot of potential there. I don't want to just cherry pick technical solutions to solve the problem. I think it really is a whole of society approach, and solving that problem of epistemic security and increasing information resilience.
Yeah, and I think, you were talking a little bit about legislation. We had Representative Kilmer here. And so I think it's important for us to also think about what's happening right now in the legislative and regulatory space. And there's been a couple developments, right? There was an executive order on artificial intelligence from the White House that came out about a month ago, as well as an AI summit that was held at Bletchley Park in the United Kingdom. And so, Clement, you've spent some time working with different regulators around the world, things like the Digital Services Act and other, proposals for legislation and regulation. From your perspective, and the work that you do on trust and safety and artificial intelligence, what is needed? What kind of guardrails would be helpful?
I wish I had an easy answer that's just like a slam dunk I could just spell for you. I do not, but I have a few starting thoughts. But first, speaking of resilience, there's this episode of the Today Show I really like that goes into the dangers for photography and not knowing what's real anymore. And what I really like about it is that it's from 1990 when Photoshop was released. And that's not to say that and you can find it online, it's out there, I can send a link afterwards. That's not to say, of course, that we should trivialize the moment we're in. We're in a transition phase with rapid technological deployment that people are not familiar with. And that is cause for caution, concern, all of the things we're discussing. But it's also worth remembering the last time we thought truth was going to disappear because photos were manipulated, and the fact that we survived that.
All the way back to the Gutenberg press as well.
Very much
right?
so. And so just to inject that note of we also have to trust the folks that we ultimately serve to have over time adaptation. And the question is, how do we manage that interim period? And yes, to provenance as well, you may have seen Google deploy a solution in this space called SentID, which is our approach towards kickstarting a broader provenance effort, hopefully. But back to regulation. My personal take here, for what it's worth, but I'm curious for yours, Bilba, I find it very difficult to come up with hard and set rules on this exact topic at this moment in time, given how little we know about what will be useful next year and how fast the technology is moving, not just in the attack side, but on the defense side, right? If you had asked people a year ago, they would have said, it has to be cryptographically signed metadata. If you ask them this year, they'll say, well, watermarking also works. Maybe next year will be something else, right? And so what you really, really don't want as a regulator is an approach that enshrines in stone a technological form factor that may be relevant today, but may not be as relevant tomorrow. So right now, I think certainly any effort to urge the ecosystem, for lack of a better word, I don't love that word, it's not well defined, to coalesce together on a set of standards or best practices or ways to navigate these detection and provenance questions at scale, I think are very welcome. But any attempt at deciding these solutions before they are appropriately discussed, in my mind, would be detrimental. So that's sort of my first thought. On the flip side, I've seen a lot of things I've liked about the executive order, such as, for instance, urging government agencies to play a leading role in setting best practices and deploying provenance technology themselves. I think that's very smart. It's a good way to sort of kickstart the machine. Certainly, research in this space, for the very reasons we're discussing, which is it's still early, is very important as well. And I think last but not least, everything government can do to support the public's education, to your point, Bilba, is very important. It's not like any of us is perfect. I mean, even adept practitioners of this and misinfo get caught sometimes overwhelmed by their emotions, and it happens to all of us, and that's perfectly fine. But a good sense of some of the methods to use when confronted with a piece of content online that flares up our emotions, some of the ways to think through the credibility of imagery and video, some of the ways to think through what's called the liar's dividend, which is this notion that now that really realistic, convincing fake audio and video and images exist, it's possible for someone to pretend that the real thing is fake, right? Like if you catch me red-handed doing something I shouldn't do on camera, my defense can be, well, the video is fake. I never did this thing. It's just an elaborate deep fake. So helping people think through all of these kinds of ramifications and what they mean for how they should approach what they see online, I think is going to be very important. And education is a big part of playing that. But Bilba.
So I have some thoughts. Having worked for a social media platform then a large AI developer, and now a think tank. Very interesting, like triumvirate of experiences. But now I can say how I feel about the past two experiences. I wonder where regulation can be really, really helpful. And I'll push back just a little bit. Regulation that can actually happen today is possible is more on a use case side, right? So rather than mandating that certain technologies be used, technology, as Clement said, can consistently evolve, right? We're not going to know what kind of deepfake detection technology is going to appear in a year. I mean, maybe not even in a week. But what we can legislate and what there can be legislation on today is more so harmful use cases, right? So one example of that is the criminalization of non-consensual intimate imagery. This is a topic that I'm very passionate about, particularly because I spent time leading product safety for DALL-E at OpenAI, so for image generation, and sexual content is a huge, huge problem with image generation. It's kind of broadly been not accepted as a huge problem, but known as a huge problem. And the big challenge with non-consensual intimate imagery is that there's all these tools that exist, right, where you can take a picture of somebody and, you know, put a different face on it, or completely undress them. So they're actually fully clothed in the original photo, but they're undressed in such a way using such an advanced tool that they actually do appear naked, and it could be believable to the human eye. This is detrimental, especially for women. Several women have spoken out against this, like Nina Jankowicz, who is a predominant voice in the disinformation space. And I don't think that we need to have a good handle on what technology will look like in the future to criminalize the dissemination of non-consensual intimate imagery, right? Non-consensual intimate imagery that is, or sorry, to criminalize the synthetic version of that. Non-consensual intimate imagery is already a huge problem, but with the acceleration of artificial intelligence being now used to undress people, put them in positions that they weren't actually in, it's incredibly dangerous, especially for women and minorities. And that's something that there can be legislation on today. In fact, there have been several states that have actually passed legislation. Most recently last week, Governor Whitmer from Michigan passed legislation on deepfakes in general, and most specifically in an election context. But there's other states like New York that have passed legislation on synthetic non-consensual intimate imagery. So I think that's a huge, huge AI problem. It's also a societal problem that's being exacerbated by AI, and there can be regulation on that today. That I am confident in, right? Very niche use case, but really, really dangerous one, and really harmful one. And I think that given that I've spent so much time on image, it really cannot be understated how much images change hearts and minds, right? Especially on the internet. There's some studies that show that people have a more visceral, vivid response to an image versus text. And when images can distort reality, whether it's even like a Photoshop alteration to an image versus it being a non-consensual intimate image that is synthetic, there needs to be a lot of regulatory focus on that. The other thing that I would say that there should be more regulation on is thinking through common issues that have been problems for a really long time, but with the acceleration of AI, they're kind of coming into congressional consciousness. And I'd like to highlight social media harms in general, right? Like those have been discussed for a very, very long time. There hasn't been much federal movement on that. And now I think because of AI acceleration, there's lots of bills in the Senate and the House addressing this problem. They've not been passed yet, but I have hope that there will be some movement on some legislation for social media harms and broadly the need for transparency. I think what this AI era, whatever you'd like to call it in generative AI, has really shown me is the importance of transparency and accountability, especially for actors across the content supply chain. So whether that means large AI developers that or have technologies that create images, create text, right? All the way down to editing tools, right? Where you can edit specific images, all the way down to social media platforms where those images are disseminated. There's a sheer lack of transparency around how algorithms work, what kind of deceptive content and practices we're seeing on these various different platforms. And so I think that this is maybe it's not too little too late, I hope, for us to pass some social media legislation. And I think the AI stuff really brings a lot of it into focus and into consciousness. So I'm hopeful for that. The one last thing I will say, and I'll stop, but I really care about regulation. The FTC has actually been doing really awesome things as of late on AI. Most recently, they passed a resolution on compulsory process, which basically means that any company that creates an AI product or service has to respond to investigative requests. So they're like legally obliged to respond to these requests to pass over information. This was never a thing before, right? So like labs could not respond to the FTC, never respond to the FTC, say they're going to respond to the FTC, but drag it out over time. And now they're actually like legally comply. They have to comply to these requests to respond. Otherwise, there will be penalties. So the government is doing things. Maybe some of them are like not super noticeable, right? So shout out to the FTC on that, I guess. But things are happening, and I'm hopeful for that. But I think there is regulation that can happen today to protect people, protect their presence online, and help solve some of the older social media problems that we haven't quite addressed yet.
Well, thank you so much for inserting a bit of hope into this conversation. But I would be remiss if I did not bring up some doomsdaying when we're talking about AI. And in particular, there are a number of upcoming elections around the world in 2024. There are also ongoing global conflicts in Armenia, Azerbaijan, in Ukraine and Russia, Israel and Hamas. You mentioned, some work that you've done on conflict and trust and safety. So I'm wondering if you can both address this question, which is, how do you anticipate that AI-enabled disinformation, influence campaigns will impact those elections? Will it, be greater than what we've seen from other sort of more traditional non-AI-enabled threats? And how are you seeing some of those things already happening today?
Do you want to go first, or should I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sure.
No one wants to talk about the doomsday, right?
No, I very much.
We can talk about it for a while. First, I think you talk about election, but I want to emphasize a point Bill made, which is ever since the first time I talked about deepfakes in a forum such as this one, which was, I think, 2018, the overwhelming emphasis has been on things like election and conflict in terms of the risks and the concerns that were expressed. The overwhelming reality of what is happening to people with these tools day in, day out is what Bilva described, which is like the use of these tools to sexualize women against their will is a known reality that I think we as a company have taken measures against. I can talk about, but the point is, you're right. This is something that is a current, very real threat to real humans from high school to any age of their lives, and that is having a real effect. So just thank you for calling it out. And it is important indeed. Now back to elections. I think the other thing that came out of that first Wendiating gathering was, so this was the moment when the first deepfake models really came out, and there was a poll to assess among participants, who were all experts, whether the next election would be the deepfake election. Like, are we going to see a deepfake undermine the election this time around? And about 75% of the room thought so. This was 2018. It did not happen in 2018. It did not happen in 2020. It did not happen in 2022. That does not mean it won't happen next year, to be clear. It is just a good reminder to me every single time I'm asked this kind of question that we should not mistake the availability of technology for the certainty of its use in the ways we imagine. We tend to do a lot of mirror imaging and project ourselves on the adversary and think, what would I do if I were in their shoes? Because quite often they have their own heuristics, their own economics, their own incentives, and they act somewhat differently than we would think. So all this to say, I'm now going to go into some of the risks, but also I think we should all be very cognizant that these risks may not materialize, and we should not assume that they will, and we should prepare for different risks to materialize, or we should be more nimble in our response than just anchoring on these things. That being said, of course, when it comes to conflicts and or to elections, the worst case scenario continues to be convincing fake audio or video or imagery that is powerful enough to overturn the course of an election. So presenting an election official or candidates doing something that they never said or done. In the case of a conflict, suggesting that something happened that did not, or conversely hiding the casualties of something that did happen. We've seen some of that to an extent with Ukraine and with what's happening in Gaza. But curious for others' thoughts here. I wouldn't call this an overwhelming pivot yet in terms of the kinds of threats we saw before. That's not to say the tools were available before. That's to say there's a lot you can do with a crappy video editor, some cropping, and creative editing, right? And patching different bits of video together that already achieved some of these goals at a lower cost. And so in that sense, like, yes, these things are currently happening, and we can talk about some of the examples. And certainly, again, like talking about my company for a second, we have rules against these things if we see them and we take action. But I wouldn't call this a seismic shift yet. The other thing people are discussing a lot is the use of LLMs in this context. Can they be used to persuade people more efficiently? Can they be used to create content more cheaply and translate it more efficiently? So enabling foreign actors who would target US elections, for instance, to better localize their content in a way that sounds more authentic and more educated to a US audience? Can they enable for better targeting of specific groups that might be vulnerable? All of these questions are in the open. I think the most recent example I've seen was actually a report this morning about a Russian op called nicknamed Doppelganger, who was caught. Their known MO is to create, to impersonate known news websites, hence Doppelganger, and then try to use that to disseminate their messages. And apparently, recently they were caught using most likely LLMs to write articles for these impersonated news websites. So that's one recent use case for LLMs in this space. Again, I am not entirely sure yet, at least as an individual, how much of a differential threat this represents from the previous model, where they could already impersonate news websites, and maybe they did not use LLMs to write article, but maybe they could use mTurk, maybe they could just like copy and paste articles from somewhere else. And I don't know what the differential impact is there. So long and short of it is, I think as far as we are concerned as a company, we take these threats obviously extremely seriously, because the fact that it hasn't, like, nothing has completely blown through the roof just yet doesn't mean it won't tomorrow. And so we are trying really hard to be ready for this. Again, I could go into the panoply of tools and services and policies we have to try to do that, but this is something that our elections team are very conscious of, and our trust and safety teams are very much on the lookout for. At the same time, honestly, if you were asking me to guess, I don't know where I would put my money on what will happen in the coming year. And in some ways, I am more worried about the liar's dividends that we were discussing earlier than I am about the actual threat of fake audio and imagery, because fake audio and imagery often can be debunked. It may not be immediate, but oftentimes, even if it's not with a snazzy detector, folks like Bellingcat or like fact checkers will eventually figure out the reality of what happened, and they can debunk things, even if it's exposed. Whereas the ability for anyone to deny anything they don't like, because it could be a deepfake, that's more pervasive, right? And I don't know exactly how we'll deal with that.
I'm definitely curious, to see what happens on that front. That's an area that I'm personally quite concerned with, which is, some threat actors in this space are more interested in not getting people to believe anything in particular, but it's to trust nothing at all. And that's where that liar's dividend comes into play. But I appreciate sort of both of you raising some of the other issues, like, sexual exploitative imagery that is, sort of very immediate and prevalent problem when it comes to artificial intelligence. But Bilba, I'd be curious for your thoughts on, what you're seeing right now in terms of ongoing conflicts and upcoming elections, and what you think we might expect.
Yeah, definitely. So I know that we often take a very US-centric approach when we're thinking about elections, but there's a lot of elections happening in 2024.
28, I think.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Right?
There's more than 20 elections for sure that are happening, and I think that most of my concern with elections are those that are happening outside of the United States. So I'd like to tell like a mini anecdote about this investigation that I did with a colleague and friend of mine who is at Columbia SIPA right now, of this essentially disinformation network that was using AI-generated images, AI-generated deepfake audio and video on TikTok, YouTube, and a variety of other platforms on the internet, in order to spread the super niche narrative. And the narrative was that this man who is from Lahore, Pakistan, named Mohammed Qasim, is set to be the Mahdi, or basically the next coming of Muhammad himself, right? So the next coming of the divine, the Messiah on earth, which religious stuff is very difficult to content moderate. But most Muslims would say that this is blasphemy, right? A man saying that he is the next coming of the Messiah. So we can say that that is generally false information. But this network that is basically promoting this narrative was using all sorts of AI generated images, audio deepfakes of actually known like muftis and prominent leaders in Islamic communities, religious leaders, saying that this man is the next coming of the Mahdi, using their deepfake audio of their voices. I looked at the videos, some of them were quite sophisticated and spread all over the internet. And when I originally did this investigation, which was several months ago, this had already gotten 540 million views on TikTok alone. I had imagined that it's way higher now. And I checked yesterday just for fun, and it has not really been deplatformed, right? So this is still existent on the internet, and that's just TikTok alone. Over 300,000 K followers on YouTube, for example. So really big network, a good amount of like actual engagement, which we honestly don't see a lot for any sort of influence operation. But it's a very unique kind of influence operation. It's occurring in the global south. It's in a variety of different languages, including Urdu, Hindi, English, some Southeast Asian languages as well, being spread. And it's not really being deplatformed, and it's affecting what people are thinking, right? And even though it may be a niche religious narrative, we don't know how that's going to affect people's actions, right? The idea of Messiah rising up in real life, it seems kind of extreme and apocalyptic, but we don't know how that defines someone's worldview or what that could prompt that person to do. And some of these videos actually encouraged violent action as well, which is obviously not promising and very, very concerning to me. So all of this to say, this case study is meant to show that there's a lot of content on the internet that is not being addressed, that is occurring in outside of the United States, that could have huge impacts on people in general and in an election context as well, though this particular operation wasn't necessarily in an election context. And so that's what I'm really worried about. I'm worried about information manipulation in the global south by all sorts of state-sponsored, non-state, new actors using AI to legitimize their narratives, to glorify their narratives, gain more attention and engagement. And I'm also worried about localized disinformation. So for example, if a deepfake video of Joe Biden were to be released tonight, it would probably be debunked very, very quickly, right? Not only because we're in the US, but because he's the president of the United States. At the same time, if a deepfake video of a school principal saying racist language, which actually happened very recently, there's a Vice article about it, that would not be debunked in the same amount of time. And that would change the hearts and minds of kids who go to this high school about their principal who didn't actually say racist stuff, but in this video was saying this stuff. So I think we really need to think about how much information can be weaponized in settings where it cannot be thoroughly debunked and not debunked in time. And we should also think about how a lot of these resources like debunking, detection, et cetera, they all happen after the fact, right? The disinformation has already been spread. It's already affected somebody in some sort of way. And we can't really measure that impact either, as what I was talking about before, right? So it's a really, really horrible problem. So it's really hard to say how much it's actually affecting people, even when takedowns are effective. And as like Clement knows, like it's really hard to have effective takedowns, especially when they're in a variety of different languages. You have to have language coverage, right, on trust and safety teams. You have to make sure the team is mobilized to detect such content. We have to make sure it's aligning to a specific content policy. And if it may be in a gray area where it doesn't quite fit a content policy, but we know it's still kind of bad, so what do you do then? Like, completely understand how difficult it is to do that on the TNS side as well, not just as a researcher. But that's what concerns me the most right now about elections, those localized settings and elections that are not happening in the United States. And the last thing I'll say is, yes, it's hard to say how much these operations are being more successful as a result of artificial intelligence. But my research and my projections tell me kind of where I think this field is going is what I like to call the 3 S's, scale, speed, and sophistication. So broadly seeing more scale of these operations, there's a Center for Security and Emerging Technology study that came out a little while ago about how much cheaper it is to produce propaganda as a result of open and closed source large language models. So it's cheaper, you need less bodies to create propaganda. And if your propaganda was already kind of spammy anyways, you probably don't really need like the best prompt engineers or an amazing tool to continue doing the really bad propaganda that's not quite great. But you can do it at a higher scale, right? And there's all sorts of different things you can do with like APIs, botnets, and all forms of artificial intelligence to increase scale. The second part is speed, which is kind of aligned with scale in the same way, right, where you need less people working on this content, you can also automate a lot of this, right? So there's been new tools that have come out like Auto GPT, where the model itself does all of the tasks for you, and you just kind of watch it do different things, which is pretty scary, in my opinion. Can be really helpful if you're doing small tasks, but like imagine that being connected to like an email, imagine that being connected to a social media site, and so forth, right? So there's a lot of opportunity for automation with increased improvements in AI. And the last part I think scares me the most, which is sophistication, right? So now we're seeing, Spamiflage Dragon now have access to a tool that can actually really effectively translate Mandarin text into English text, into Tagalog, into Swahili, right? In a way that they could never do before, in the way that traditional translation tools don't quite fit the bill. And maybe they can tailor it to a millennial versus someone who is Gen Z, versus somebody who may be a construction worker versus someone like me who works in foreign policy. Use different kinds of languages to get to what people's desires are, what their needs are, and so forth. Does it do this really, really well? Not necessarily, but does it do it better than a only Mandarin language speaker who doesn't really understand how Gen Z, for example, thinks in the United States? Oh yeah, way better, right? Because they don't have that context. And it gives you a little bit more cultural context. So my fear is as these models get better and better, this leaves room for nation state actors, especially those that were already well resourced, to become way more sophisticated at a much greater scale with much greater speed.
If I may ask a follow-up, one of the, you mentioned state actors, but, when I think about the people that really benefit the most from scalability and speed, I often think about financially motivated actors as well. Troll farms that, are really just designed to make money. They may focus on politics, but, one prominent example is Macedonian troll farms. They're really just trying to get clicks out of the websites that they were creating. So I'd be curious for your thoughts and definitely for yours on whether you think these kinds of tools are going to be utilized more by nation state threat actors or these financially motivated actors.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I'm not sure if I can say whether one actor or the other would use it more, but I wrote a recent RAND commentary on the basically dismantling the disinformation business of Chinese influence operations. Long title, but essentially it's about how all these different companies have been weaved into Chinese IO, right? And so disinformation for hire is very much a present problem. It's been a past problem. It will be a future problem. And yeah, I'm equally worried about financial actors, especially ones that are contracted out by nation state actors. Like if nation states don't really want to do their own dirty work, if they want to have some more attribution deniability, they're more likely to use outside content farms or outside actors to do that work for them. And so I'm really worried for a disinformation plus AI nexus as a service to really start gaining some traction in the space. And having a lot of this work being farmed out will also make it more difficult to establish attribution from trust and safety teams, especially if new actors show up, right? There's a list of, for example, Chinese IO companies or companies that have been involved in Chinese IO either wittingly or unwittingly. There was a really great Graphica report that was recently about a British company called Synthesia that was involved in a Chinese IO campaign. Still don't know whether they knew about it or not, but there's certainly financially motivated actors that are going to be involved, both wittingly and unwittingly, into the process for creating and disseminating disinformation. And I think that's going to make the defense space way harder to try to figure out, like, well, is it Russia? Is it not Russia? Should we care if it's not Russia? Like, it's definitely going to add complexities.
Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's where my mind goes. The good news is that on a defense space, most of the policies we have are behavior-based. We don't really care if you're Russia or not. We care that you are coordinating and deceptively disseminating information. We care that you are using something to impersonate someone, or you're using deceptive deepfakes in any way, shape, or form. If we can prove that it's Russia doing it, even better. But if we can, the rule says you can't do this on our services, for most of our services, and that's enough for us to take action, which is how on the defense side you get rid of that complexity, as you should. But that being said, I do think that I understand that there's a in your framework, speed, scale, and sophistication are separate. In my mind, it's sort of blurred together because the state actors always had sophistication if they wanted to, right? What this is adding for them is ability to deploy sophistication more cheaply and more at scale. But like sophistication is something that if they really wanted to do Hollywood quality editing, they could, but they have the resources for it. They just never wanted to. So the speed and scale are the things that really change that, and those that benefit most from that and from these new capacities are indeed the smaller actors who never had access to this sophistication in the first place, and who are now able to do this very efficiently. And the state actors are interesting because of their incentives, right? Thomas Fried isn't here today, but his book goes into the incentives of the perpetrators of influence operations for different states. And oftentimes they have their own bureaucratic incentives, which may or may not be focused on effectiveness, right? Sometimes it's just about, well, you want to tell your boss you did a really impactful thing, and so you're going to put out a lot of content out there. Maybe that's what Dragon Bridge's doing. And then you can say, I published X amount of videos, and look how we're disinforming. And your boss is happy with that. And we should remember that because like we sometimes worry about the inefficiencies of governments in our own space and the things we know about, and we assume that foreign governments are super efficient for the things we care about, we worried about. They're not always, right? So the incentives of government actors are complicated and unclear. The incentives of financially motivated actors are very clear. What they want is efficiency because they want to make money. So they have a very, very strong incentive to deploy this kind of technology in the most efficient way they can, with the highest ROI they can, not to achieve a political outcome or whatever it is, but just because if it gets them the money they want, that's their model. So yes, that's sort of certainly the part we were talking about elections before, but that's the part I would be very concerned about, not just for like disinfo, but for scams, spam, impersonation, blackmail, all of the horrible things you might do with new tools if you're a bad actor. And I think we are, as a trust and safety organization right now, like certainly ramping up our game to try to be ready for what could be an onslaught in those spaces.
It's interesting that you bring up sophistication because both of you had sort of brought up people will use the lowest hanging fruit available technology that they can, right? And you talked a little bit about videos, and if a video came out impersonating Joe Biden, it would be debunked. And that reminded me of the early days of this current invasion of Ukraine, where there was, I would say, a cheap fake or a shallow fake of Zelensky, where his neck was not quite aligned to his head. And it was very clearly a fake video. But, you know, the Zelensky team actually pre-bunked that in a way that actually made it, you know, its effects negligible. And so I'm thinking a lot about, you know, who's using the actual sophisticated tools and whether, you know, the sophistication actually matters to the threat actors. I'm curious what you guys think. You know, is it, you know, are they just going to use whatever this is the cheapest? Like, do they have to use these large language models or anything else available to them?
Well, I can start, but I'm sure you have thoughts as well. Honestly, I'm curious about it. I don't have a ready-made answer. I think each actor has its own economics, right? And it burns down to the economy. It burns down to like, and when I say economy, I mean their incentive structure and what they're trying to maximize for. And that incentive structure may not be as simple as we think it is. Again, a bureaucratic organization might be optimizing for impact, or it might be optimizing for whatever makes the boss happy this month, and maybe what number he wants to see on, or she wants to see on her reporting card, right? A financial actor might be optimizing for clicks, and maybe what gets the most clicks is not necessarily a very sophisticated image. Maybe it is just a very cheap but incendiary image that gets people reacting. So I think, in my mind at least, in the same way that a lot of the business world is understanding that AI is a revolution and needs to figure out how to use it, but doesn't have quite sorted the use cases yet, I'm imagining the same thing is happening on the attackers' side in this space, where like they know that this is something they have to look at and consider and find ways to deploy. I'm not sure, I haven't seen evidence of any one of them having cracked the model yet for themselves. I'm expecting we'll see some fluctuations in the space, especially as more powerful open source tools becomes more available, because we haven't talked about that, but of course, a lot of the tools like DALL-E, giving an example, that exist in the open have baked in safety measures, which don't ward off all risks by any stretch of the imagination, but at least create friction. If you're a bad person who wants to try to use them for bad purposes, will make it more challenging for you to do so. Obviously, there's a lot of open technology out there. I'm not going to name names, and that's not the point, but this is it was always going to happen. No one can copyright math. And so the fact that we have now math and compute in the open means that we'll see open source tools proliferate over time, whoever puts them out. And the availability of good open source tools means that more entities will consider what they can do with those, I think, in the next year or so. Sorry, it's really a non-answer to your question.
No,
I don't have one.
It's something that I think we have to think about, just like we have to think about the incentives of the threat actors. We also think about, who's actually going to use this stuff, and is it going to be that sophisticated? I don't know if you have anything to add on that.
Yeah,
front.
I have some thoughts. I'm
Yeah.
really glad you brought up open source. In the back of my head, I was like, ooh, when should I talk about open source? Because it, in many ways, in this threat space, it genuinely does make things a lot worse. There have been several studies done shown that, like, with lots of different open source models, safeguards can easily be removed out of models, and those particular models, especially when they're fine-tuned on any sort of harmful content, right? So if you want to create a hate bot, you can fine-tune it on like the worst parts of 4chan, which was, that kind of already happened on the internet, I believe last year. Or if you want to create a model that's just creating non-consensual intimate imagery that's synthetic of women, you can also do that after fine-tuning an image model. That has also already happened with a service like Civit AI and others that have formed. So I'm definitely really concerned about open source in that sense, because not only can you do more bad stuff with less safeguards, it's also really difficult to control it, right? Like there's no individual company, body, consortium really tracking the damages and effects of open source and controlling it, because by nature, open source code is diffused, right? Which also comes with lots of really great benefits, which we can talk about. So it's not just, open source bad. It's more of like open source enabling more bad stuff because of the nature of it being more available to more people. In terms of, what was the original question? The original question was about large language models and sophistication. I think my gut reaction to this is similar to yours. I do think that there's been some evidence of known actors like experimenting, like a willingness to evolve. And that kind of goes back to that. I keep bringing up those Chinese IO actor mostly because like I worked on them all the time that I was at LinkedIn, and I'm kind of working on them now, but they're showing a willingness to evolve. Are they doing it super well? Not really, right? Like they use those Synthesia-based AI avatars to promote a fake news outlet called Wolf News. And it was like really obvious that it was not a real person. It also got very limited engagement. Dragon Bridge is known for posting a lot on the internet and getting very little engagement. That's kind of their vibe. Who knows? Maybe they'll change depending on inner bureaucratic goals. But they're showing a willingness to evolve. Like the same actor recently also had a network that was reported by Microsoft's Threat Analysis Center in posting AI-generated images to undermine America in a variety of different ways. So like images of like the Statue of Liberty being presented in a way to besmirch American ideals, et cetera, et cetera. So they're showing a willingness to evolve and be creative. Whether that's actually impacting more people more profoundly is once again a very challenging question and super hard to measure. At the very least, tech platforms can say that they haven't gotten much engagement or impressions, clicks, likes, reshares of that content. But genuinely, we don't really know how it's affecting hearts and minds, so to speak. We can only measure it kind of with the numbers that we're seeing, which is also the best that we can do, but also not the perfect solution. But yeah, I'm expecting them to continuously evolve and see what works for them and what aligns with strategic priorities. And I'm almost more afraid of the little guys that we've never really heard about before using these tools, because we already don't, with the little guys we've never heard about, we don't have indicators of concern to actually track them on the internet, right? We don't have known IP addresses, email addresses, like user agents, right? We can't just go back to our repository and be like, that's China, or like, that's Pakistan. Like we don't, when you don't have that with certain non-state actors or even new state actors, it can be very difficult to establish attribution around an operation and to even know what narratives you're looking for, right? Which could hamper detection efforts as well with where we're at. So yeah, I would say my concern is probably mainly there, just because I'm thinking about this like Qasim operation that I investigated, and it was super weird and out of the blue. But like I said, it still hasn't really been deplatformed. And since me and my research partner published that article, the network has actually posted lots of stuff about us being fake researchers and spreading disinformation, which I thought was hilarious, but like with like pictures of me on their like videos, which I'm like, doesn't feel comfortable. But yeah, I'm scared about like networks like that and what they're going to be able to do, because no one's going to even know what we're looking for there.
So I wanted to, wrap up a little bit here. We're getting close to time, and we've talked a lot about the threats. We've talked a little bit about the solutions. I'd be curious for both of your thoughts in closing on, where do you think we're going? What does the trend landscape look like? I know it's hard to predict, and I'm asking you to speculate, which
Easy
is
question.
a really difficult thing to do for people who care about integrity and not speculation. But that said, I'd be curious, are we, you've worked on a lot of information integrity issues since before, this artificial intelligence conversation was starting. And so you are familiar with all iterations of these problems. Are we in a completely new era, or are we in a place where, you feel like some of these problems are solvable? You can start with that easy
Thank
question.
you. Thank you so much. You've worked in this space a lot. You must have thoughts too. We should hear them.
I'm the moderator here, so.
Sure. I see what you're doing. God, easy question. Look, okay, this is a purely personal gut reaction. It has no grounding whatsoever. This is still trying to wrap my head around all of this, obviously. But to your question, is this a completely new era, or is this the continuation of something else? It's never a complete binary. It's never either or, right? It's a spectrum. But on that spectrum, I would lean slightly more towards the continuation of something than something radically new. And that's because when it comes to these speed and scale challenges, right? That's the history of the internet. A lot of the internet harms we're talking about, and we've talked about for decades, are speed and scale problems applied to pre-existing harms. I don't know, violent extremism didn't begin with the internet, right? Calls to violence, impersonation, whatever it is, it doesn't begin with the internet. What the internet brought, it's to these challenges, a unique lens is speed and scale of connection, dissemination, creation, all of these things. We're seeing here a renewal in the speed and scale available to malicious actors, but also to great people to do great things. And that to me feels like a new stage in dynamic we've been seeing since the beginning of the internet, pretty much. And presumably, as the communication scholar you are, Olga, you'll tell me, way before the internet, go back to the printing press. Fair enough. I'm only an internet guy, but to me, that's the mindset. And what it does mean, as always with the new phase, is what I was saying before. Like, I'm not overly concerned about the long term, and you may call me out 10 years from now and tell me I was an idiot for being so sanguine. I am, however, cognizant that any transition phase is really hard to navigate, because there is a time between the moment these technologies become available and widespread and the moment where all of us are familiar enough with them to know how we want to navigate them and the information environment that has them in it. And that's the moment we're in, and that's a tricky moment. So to me, interestingly, the long term is somewhat less interesting to me, and the medium short term on these specific issues. There are long-term questions around AI, which I am by no means qualified to comment on, that are different. But this one, I feel like we really have to think of this transition phase most importantly, and making sure that we lay the groundwork for a resilient future.
That's one thing that I heard. We had a panel at Johns Hopkins last week on artificial intelligence, and we had engineers from the Whitting School of Engineering and the Applied Physics Laboratory. And one of the things they said on artificial intelligence is that to them, a lot of these models are things that they've been working with for a while. And to them, that sort of shift overnight was when there was greater access, right? All of a sudden, someone woke up the next day and ChatGPT was available to more people. And I sort of distinctly remember this time period when I was working at Meta, where all of a sudden every workshop that I attended, there was always a portion of it that was now about generative AI. And we're still in that stage, I think, right now. Here we are having this conversation. And so I think, for the people that work on the technology, that do the engineering work, this wasn't an overnight shift. This is a continuation of something that they've been studying for a long time and trying to examine. And for the people on the defending side, have been thinking about a lot. I often say to people, I've been teaching about disinformation and influence for 4 years now. And 4 years ago, I was already teaching about GAN imagery
Mhm.
and other technologies that were available to manipulate, right? We were doing that a long time ago before it was cool, right? But I want to give you the final word and sort of where you think we are. Again, I know I'm asking you to speculate, but just what you think the future looks like, and is it a continuation?
Yeah. Rand loves speculation, by the way. We made careers out
The
of
new
speculation.
tagline.
Yeah. No, I'm not speaking on behalf of Rand in that way, just a joke. But yeah, so I think there's certain things I definitely agree with in terms of it not being a brand new space, right? Like information manipulation has kind of like changed flavors over time, and we're just kind of seeing the most updated version of it, and increased capacity for, I would say, a broader range of actors to wreak havoc and do harm, which is where a lot of my concerns are. But where I would speculate, I think the most harm is actually more in the long-term things and beyond just disinformation. Like disinformation is one very small part of the information ecosystem, right? Or epistemic security, as I keep talking about over and over again. I think long-term harms and epistemic security involve a variety of different things, right? Huge part of that is just societal trust regarding information. And that's just not only a disinformation problem, that is simply an information problem that we're seeing unfold right now. And I think most of my fears are less about, niche disinformation operations done by highly sophisticated actors. Those are still clearly very big concerns, especially during conflict times, election periods. But I think that trust and safety teams, broadly, this entire space will become, over time, defensively, quite good at catching at least the most large-scale information operations for specific nation-state actors, for example. Where I think it's going to be incredibly difficult is solving the broader epistemic security problem. How people react to information, how much do they trust the media, how much do they trust AI-generated content versus real content, even if the AI-generated content is presenting a real narrative, right? And the real content created by a real human is actually misinformation. Like, how do we deal with those divides, and how do people actually become resilient to that? That's where a lot of my concern is. And to branch off into more like AI things and not just disinfo AI things, one of my huge concerns with generative AI and beyond is the concept of over-reliance on these technologies in a variety of ways, whether that's to do research, do your homework, whether that's beyond that. Romantic relationships with chatbots is becoming an issue of sorts that is arising, a very serious one. And there's all sorts of companies like Character AI, Replica AI, et cetera, that are marketing those products. Haven't really been regulated. How do you regulate that? Should we regulate that? I don't know. But all these things where people are relying more and more on technology in ways that are, in my opinion, unprecedented, right? Like nobody saw Facebook, the app, as their girlfriend. Like that wouldn't really make sense. I would hope not.
You never know. Yeah,
that's fair. But the
can
chatbot
find
that
one
has
person.
a personality, that's attuned to your likes, dislikes, right? Or the chatbot that becomes your best friend. I mean, I'm very concerned about that and what that means for epistemic security, about how people have access and think about information, and how society will evolve in time. And so I see that as the biggest long-term threat. And maybe if we can get some sort of a handle on the short-term threats of like highly specialized disinformation campaigns, providing content access to people, media literacy access, provenance information on social media platforms, large AI developers, trusted media sites, and beyond. If we can get a handle on that, then maybe we can slowly start to gather information, data about how people are actually reacting to this kinds of content, how much trust they actually have in AI-generated content versus authentic content, and what that means for the future of knowledge security.
Well, thank you so much to both of you for this conversation. Very substantive and very informative, and also in some ways does make me hopeful about what we'll be able to do with this. So thank you so much both for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Olga.
That's awesome.
And I think we can.
Thank you.
We'll stay here.
Let me just say thank you to our panel and Olga. Great moderated discussion. Thank you to Derek Kilmer. Thank you, folks here in the audience. Thanks to people who are watching at their desks or at home. And I just want to echo what you said, Olga. I think the thing that makes me the most hopeful is conversations like this among people who are truly trying to get to the right answer, with a lot of agreement and a lot of disagreement, a lot of divergent thinking, but hoping to get to convergent thinking. And let's hope that that continues. You know, I began by saying, like, we need a lot of humility as we're going forward on this. There's a lot of known unknowns and unknown unknowns. And it would be great if we had discussions like this on about 50 other issues that are bedeviling Washington. So thank you once again.
Thank you.
Thank you.